Hello and welcome. My name is Jo Frost and here with my co-host Peter Linus. This is Being Human. Hello, Peter.
Well, hello, Jo. How are you?
I am finally hot. The summer has arrived. We've got about 3 days before it leaves us again. So my computer's going to overheat, but I refuse to complain because life is finally good.
It's good. You heard it here first. Jo is hot. But we are not alone. It seems very weird to have this conversation while you and I are chatting, and we have a guest hanging out with us today. Our guest. Alicia.
It's Alicia, but can I really be a guest? I'm a fellow colleague. This is great. Great intro, guys. Doing fantastic.
This is how we always begin. So Alicia, well, you can say more about yourself now. Why don't you introduce yourself more fully?
I work for the Evangelical Alliance advocacy team. You might hear me on Cross-Section, head of public policy, surfing the tsunami that is the general election, faithfully serving the Lord during these times. Outside of that, I'm a bit of a fashionista. I'm just saying the comedy value. Equally loving London weather, good weather. So yeah, pleased to finally be invited onto this podcast.
I'd like to say that we've invited you onto ours before I've ever been invited onto Cross-Section. You've had lots of other people from the EA on that.
On Cross-Section once before.
Not once.
We are now scanning the back catalogues to see if that's true.
Yeah,
but there you go. Oh, well. Well, if you up your game, you might get on. You never know. This is exciting. We are discussing ethnicity, race, and what that means to being human. So we are all going to say a little bit more about ourselves than we maybe normally do. Jo, I'm going to go to you first, because how would you... So the British Census for the UK Census Form, which we all had to do in 2021, asked us questions, not about race, but about ethnicity. Do you remember what kind of boxes you ticked or what you would say about yourself when it comes to a question like that?
Yeah, so I would tick the white British box. But I do have numerous arguments with complete strangers on streets regarding my ethnicity, where they get quite angry at me for not being Eastern European, Mediterranean, Middle Eastern in some form or another. So I'm often assumed to be from somewhere else. But as far as I am aware, every now and then my mum comes up with some new cultural baggage, history, background, something or other in my distant past. But I've no idea if she's just making it up or whether or not there's any truth in it.
Were you born in Switzerland? Did I make that up?
Oh, yeah. I was born in Switzerland, but I only lived there for 4 months. So all I get is extra paperwork. Nothing else helpful. So you get like those new passport forms where you go to like question 4 and it says, if you were born in Britain, go to question 78. If not, go to question 5. And you very quickly lose the will to live.
Well, in a moment, I'll tell you why the question almost certainly says if you were born in the UK, not Britain, but that's to rush ahead to me. So Alicia, the census form, what sort of things are you ticking on that form?
I would tick Black British Caribbean for a census perspective. If I was to describe who I am, where I'm from, I live in Essex, born and raised, and willfully embrace the banter of an Essex girl because I've redeemed it. There's nothing at a first glance that you think I'm an Essex girl apart from my Cockney accent occasionally. As I mentioned, Black British Caribbean, my mum's from Trinidad and Tobago. But if I was to ask the somewhat awkward question, where are you really from? I would then continue to go on and say my ancestral roots go back to Ghana and South Africa. And then through the transatlantic slave trade, through Scotland and Grenada to Trinidad, and then back to the United Kingdom, Essex. So yeah, I'm a combination of all those things and none of those things because of Jesus Christ. So yeah, that's me.
Awesome. Redeeming being an Essex girl. As I think most listeners probably now know, I'm from Northern Ireland, live in Northern Ireland, where there were dolphins out the window earlier, which totally distracted me this morning. So this is a different kind of ethnic question in my world, I suppose. I have a British passport. I can get an Irish passport. Depends where I want to travel to, whether I want one. I do want one of those because it's much easier to go to the EU. I'm Northern Irish, British and Irish, depending on who I'm talking to. So I would ethnically tick the white British box. Family are French Huguenots. And I guess, like, we are a much less culturally diverse country, but that question of where you're from and what's going on and that kind of identity markers is framed very differently. Mainly people get you to spell something here to see how you say H or Hitch as a little mini identity marker about whether you're from a Protestant, Catholic, nationalist, unionist background. Schools do the same thing. And all of that sets you in a little box in my world, but it's a different kind of box. But I guess it starts that framing question again around ethnicity and race. And we're going to look at even those terms and how they can be helpful or unhelpful. But we're also acknowledging, like, we've already had a little bit of back and forth because this is a tricky topic. It's one that we're all really passionate and interested about. We had the conversation, Joe and I, we tended not to have guests on this series, Joe, but we were like, we just can't have this conversation without having a guest. But we also don't want to say, oh, let's just have a guest to tell us on behalf of everybody their views. Like, we've got to acknowledge the difficulty of navigating some of this. But Alicia is going to do her best as me. So, like, we won't deal with everything. We can't deal with everything. No one person is representing the views of any one group, obviously, but it sometimes needs to be said. In a moment, we're going to go through the lens and remind ourselves, but when it comes to those terms, race and ethnicity and nationality, I think they have varying degrees of usefulness, because race is an older term in many ways, originally thought to be kind of scientific, and that was the kind of, you could classify different groups based on scientific differences between them. But I think generally the understanding has shifted to say we're all part of one human race. And particularly post the Holocaust and the way the Nazis were defining race and Aryan race, we've moved away from that and talked a lot more about ethnicity. But ethnicity, I would suggest, talks about heritage, language, where you're from, culture. So it's a less precise term, but I think more useful in the conversation. But interested to hear your views on that.
I think it's important to make the distinction, and I did say to you, let's not use them interchangeably. I think for myself, particularly with that kind of politics, policy hat on, ethnicity, and particularly when we come into the conversations of injustice, discrimination, and difference, ethnicity is a marker to exemplify, to talk about the difference that Black Caribbeans have from Black Africans or Hispanics or white British, and they're not all the same. And so trying to do a homogenous group, I feel, is somewhat careless, but it's easy, just race generically, without really resolving the important conversations that we need to have about difference and how those are experienced by different ethnic groups.
That strikes me, and I'm asking you both, that racism remaining the term is slightly unhelpful as well, because we're saying race isn't actually a very useful category. It's really around ethnicity. We are probably stuck with the term racism, and it does a job, but it's funny because we're really saying it's to do with different ethnicities. It's beyond the physical characteristics. I think race feels like an older, slightly outdated term, but it is still in play, and people are using them interchangeably. And I think, so the whole thing, language is going to be one of our points, isn't it? That it gets confusing really quickly on this. Joe, do you want to come in? Because, I mean, language is your specialist subject. But I think the precision of terms is both difficult and problematic.
I think that you just like named my greatest fear. That whilst I love language, I also get how easy it is to be misheard and misunderstood through imprecise or incredibly precise use of language. That language in and of itself can become a source of conflict, of division, and relational fracturing. It is no surprise that we see in Babel that God scattered humanity by confusing our language. It is the source of our conflict. So language is massive. I think that was a couple of things that were just said even just now. We haven't even got to the lens yet, so this is going to be a long conversation, but it's going to be great. That question around racism, and then Alicia, your point around difference. And I think that a little bit starts to pull at some of the questions that I have around this, that I get uncomfortable when I see ethnicity and division around ethnicity and othering and oppression and and the like around ethnicity as just an example of humans' inability to cope with each other's difference. And it is a marker as opposed to something elevated. And I do think racism as a term helps remind us of the significance of abuse around somebody's ethnicity and their culture and their background and that source of alienation and othering. I think that's a really important thing because it reminds us that it's structural, it's systemic, it's historical, and ultimately it is absolutely rooted in sin. And so for me, I get nervous when we just come down to cultural differences and say ethnicity is just about difference. I get uncomfortable there. But I also recognize the really helpful distinction to say there is one human race. And therefore, it is our fractured understanding of each other's humanity that causes this kind of abuse and this kind of othering.
I mean, I 100% agree with that. There is, using the word difference again, something different between different and discrimination. And I spoke about ethnicity, but actually, when we go to the area of nationality, go to an immigration officer with a certain passport, and you will see how differently you will be treated based on your nationality and your passport. There are some passports that carry great weight when you travel to different parts of the world, and some that carry a weight behind it because of the politics that's going on between that nation. So there is an importance to say difference, but most importantly, I'm talking about discrimination, prejudice, and that kind of hatred undertone when we talk about ethnic difference. Yeah.
Yeah, and so racism is that discrimination, so to treat differently in a negative way, an abusive way, or a diminishing way based on a series of categories we have in the UK. Those will include colour, nationality, ethnicity, religion, etc. And we have specifically racial discrimination also identified in law. A reminder that we are working our way through the lens, because that's one of the ways we're navigating, rather than just doing a kind of, oh my goodness, we're going to talk about everything to do with this area. We are going to work our way through the lens and see how the lens helps us to put ethnicity in the center of the lens, really, in this conversation, to look at significance, how we see others and source our own significance in this. How do we wrestle with our sense of identity and dignity and equality around these issues? Then we will move to connection. How does that frame our relationships, our sense of justice in these conversations? We will look at presence, what it means to be embodied in this moment, and that will have a significant part of our conversation around that. How does the way we look and the way we are perceived to look, and how does other people's perception and where we come from and our cultural heritage, how do all those things, bodies, place, culture, time, bring us together? And finally, how do we participate in one of the most contested kind of conversations that's going on in our culture? How do we engage in this conversation? So we come first with significance. How do we see ourselves? How are we seen? How do we wrestle with fundamental questions around identity, dignity, equality? As we were talking, as we were preparing for this, one of the things we all recognized was that the murder of George Floyd, it was really a significant tipping point culturally and globally in this conversation in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and what we've seen around this.
Yeah, I think it was fascinating what happened with just the sheer impact of George Floyd globally. It was in the middle of COVID. There was nothing else on the news. Nothing else was cutting through. It was as if every journalist only had one word left in their inbox. And yet this story did. It elevated itself so much more loudly than anything else. But it's been interesting. I'd love to hear from our international listeners, if this is true, from your perspective. But what I've heard is that actually in America, it has had less impact over time than it has had over here and elsewhere. That for some reason, the sheer brutality and senselessness of the murder of George Floyd cut more deeply somehow in a way that other stories hadn't. And it keeps coming back. It is now part of our social imagination. So I think the legacy of his murder and his death and the tragedy of it has actually been really impactful.
Yeah, I think the fact that we were in a lockdown and that there was no other news stories to escape to forced communities around the world, and particularly the church, to recognize that there is different experiences of a shared culture within the United Kingdom. The George Floyd incident, murder, tragedy in the US then unlocked and unleashed the reality of what's it like to be Black British in the United Kingdom, what's it like to be Black British and a Christian. It unlocked wider conversations about the arts. I remember, the Black Square and Solidarity. They were statements that were coming out across all different types of organizations, but particularly within the church. We saw a number of kind of church leaders, Black church leaders, even white church leaders hosting intentional conversations around race, identity, faith within their congregation. What does it mean? And which is, if you think about it, for the Christians, that's quite a unusual experience, given that the scriptures are so rich with difference. And so particularly the New Testament church, everything in the New Testament part beyond Pentecost is this vision of God tearing down ethnic barriers, cultural barriers, and we are made one with one another through the cross. And yet, for some reason, we've never really given attention to that. So there was a lot of sorrow that was going on within the church in terms of seeing the experience of a person of color and a Christian, and how challenging it is to engage in British society, but even within church life.
And some of the conversations that come off the back of that around how do we understand that? This is one story that absolutely gripped the nation. As you say, Joe, it was really interesting, probably more dramatic here. Whereas sadly, I think in many ways, the repeated nature of that story in the US made it less stand out. But then it raised questions about, well, what's the scale of a problem? We've had the Sewell, the race report here. We've had questions about statistics, the lived experience, the standpoint theory or standpoint epistemology, as it's sometimes called. Like, how do we understand the varying stories that we're hearing? And I find that really interesting, just sometimes how Christians respond to that. So as a culture where we tell stories, we tell testimony stories in the culture I was raised in, for the conservative Christian culture. So the stories were incredibly important, but yet when it came to issues like this, it felt like stories were being minimized. Well, that's a particular standpoint, that's your view, that's your lived experience, that's just a one-off story. And yet the next moment we're promoting the one-off story as the definitive, somebody came to Christ in this way, tell your story. And it feels like we've wrestled with that, despite being a culture that is fundamentally anchored in story and the retelling of stories, the biblical story, our encounters with Jesus stories. So I'm intrigued as to a culture that wrestles with lived experience and storytelling and how to process that, where that has been less common in a culture that has moved to the kind of, we need science, we need the stats, we need the research, we need the proof that this thing exists.
I think there is a question here around our comfortableness with talking about the difference between a story that is a celebration and an inspiration, and a story that is a lament and a grief, and ultimately a convicting story of sin. And I think that's ultimately, for me, where this challenge sits. That, of course, we want to hear the stories that inspire us and encourage us and say we're doing great, shocked. And of course, we want to diminish the stories that ask us to put a mirror up and say, where am I failing? Where am I responsible? Has this happened on my watch? Was this me? Am I culpable? And we are quite comfortable sometimes talking about systemic sin and structural racism and looking at institutions, but we get very, very uncomfortable talking about what am I responsible for and where is the plank in my own eye. And so I wonder whether or not the desire to diminish the personal account is because as soon as it is a person stood in front of you, then it is on your humanity to know how to respond.
Absolutely. Once you're presented with a one-on-one before you, and as Christians, we then become responsible. How do we respond to that? And I think the whole Black Lives Matter race conversation in the UK, the one thing that it should have inspired longer term, which it hasn't, is do you really see racism? Do you see people for the challenges that they experience, or are you somewhat negligible, somewhat got glazed, rose-tinted windows that because you live in the same area, because you're in the same friendship group, because you went to the same Russell Group University or not, or job, that your experience and in the world is the same? And when someone says, actually, yes, I do have the shared experience as you, I do have the same degree, I am on the same page grade, but my experience of the world or even our community is different. Will you help me? Or will you come alongside me? Or will you listen to that and not try and fix that? That's very hard in our humanity, to absorb that level of pain and be confronted with that and do the long game of perseverance and plodding and listening and learning and maturing that is ultimately required to then move into what is the end part of this lens of participation and doing that well. So it's a hard starting place, but it's an important one.
And then in terms of how the God story comes into play here, I guess each of us have been hinting in various ways as to how storied we are within the God story, how we are seen by God, how we have to see our image primarily as made in the image of God. And those, if we've responded to that, to be what it is to be in Christ and to see our image primarily in that. But actually, the balance we have to find is that was the Israelite story as well. Their liberation story was to see themselves as people who were downcast, who cried out to God, and God hears their cries and God sets them free. And that is their ongoing story of the liberating God. And so, liberation theology has so much to teach us in terms of that. And the Black tradition, the Black church tradition, has been way better, I think, than other parts at reminding us of how to see ourselves in that story and to call ourselves out in that story. Alicia, I'll come to you first then. In terms of where you see the God story redeeming this, what strikes out most for you?
I'll start personally. I gave in my intro that I'm from Essex. I would never once upon a time say that. I'd say I'm from East London. I would disguise my accent slightly. There's always an assumption, particularly when people encounter me or see me, that because I'm Black, I go to a Black majority church, that I listen predominantly to Black music. And there was a lot of growing up in my childhood whereby I grew up in what was then a white majority working class community. I was raised by this amazing childminder because my mum was working long hours, who was like Cockney as you get. Like, if you know London and old school Roman markets, pie and mash, loved it, loved Britpop music, loved Prodigy. And some of my peers who were Black Caribbean were like, you are so odd. That is not our heritage. That is not our culture. And then, there'd be the slurring of names. I'd be called a coconut. I'd be called an Oreo. I'd be called all these things because I loved to play violin in school and was first violinist and listened to classical music. And so there's so much compounding confusion around what it means to be a person of color, or in my case, someone who's Black, British, Caribbean. There's so many assumptions, and something that I'm taking away since the George Floyd is how people perceive me and compartmentalize and box me in. I need not to do that to someone else on first appearance. They might look white Caucasian, but they might not be. Their whole experience, that how they've lived, the country they grew up, they might speak multiple languages. To actually sit and listen to people and not compartmentalize and compound identity in a way that it has baggage with different demographics. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of personal learning in that for me.
Beautiful. I think that question around identity, who gets to give it, who gets to affirm it, how is it taken away? There's so much transaction in our understanding of identity in our cultural stories at the moment. Which identity are you carrying? Are you allowed to? Do you get cancelled by the tribe or the culture that you're supposed to be a part of? What happens when you fall foul of the social norms of a specific group or whatever? Our identity feels really fragile. And I think that's what being human has often wanted to pull on, is this idea that our significance is something that has to be earned or something that has been proven, and it feels really fragile. And yet ultimately, even Alicia, as you were introducing yourself, you're a child of God. The receipt of our identity isn't in these things, although we are absolutely a culmination of our history, of our culture, of where we find ourselves in. Ultimately, at its foundation and at its core, we are seen by a God who knows us and loves us and invites us to know us. I always want to go back to Hagar in the Old Testament, and we hear her story of being abused, of being used, of being ostracized, of being part of a really toxic marriage. And she is the scapegoat and she gets shoved out and she is found to be in the desert, pregnant and alone. And she encounters God and she gives God the name El Roy. He is the God who sees. He sees her. He sees her in her plight. He sees her in her oppression. He sees her in the conflict, and he calls her out by name. Her identity is rooted in who he says she is and nothing else. I think in so many of the spaces where there is conflict and division, knowing that our identity as a received one has to be our founding storyline.
That's really helpful and really good. We need to get into connection, the kind of interrelationships, and we've obviously been talking about that. As we say, the lens is not these kind of really strict boundary categories, but this takes us into the space of asking, like, who do we relate to? How do we relate to one another? In terms of relationships, in terms of justice in areas like racial justice, and also peace. What does it look like to build peace? And I think, a couple of things for me, just to maybe kick us off, was the language piece that we've already talked about. So if we don't have language that we can talk to each other about, that makes things really tricky. I mean, I remember when I not even joined EA, even a few years ago, we'd have talked about BEM churches. It was black and ethnic minority churches. That wouldn't be language we would now use. People of color as language we've used on this podcast. Again, probably 5 years ago, we wouldn't have used that. We would talk much more about intercultural church now. But even that shift, you can feel like, have I got the terminology right? And in that moment, have I upset somebody or said something wrong? So there's a nervousness, I think, from some people around that. And I think the other thing just to acknowledge, look, is, I'm coming from one of the least culturally diverse parts of the UK. And but that's a reality. So EA has been a phenomenal learning experience for me. And to, probably about a quarter of the church are non-white in the UK. And even again, you say non-white, you want to unpack every layer of that. But also there's big generational and class questions around how we do this. So this kind of connection piece cuts across lots of areas.
Just reacting to what you were saying about you're coming from the least culturally diverse part of the UK. Yes, that's true, but you're a part of the Christian story, which is incredibly global. And the reality to that is, as a recent conversation about global migration, in 2000, 62% of Christians were people of color. That's 1.2 billion people. In 2015, that is increased by 68%, representing 1.6 billion. You are part of a culturally rich kind of faith community. Christianity is on the ascent globally. And so for our listeners, whilst we live in a place and a proximity, Northern Ireland, different part of London, Essex, or wherever you're listening, by faith, you're actually connected to a global community, that this lens of connection becomes even more important. It becomes about how are you connected either in prayer, relationship, learning about different types of discipleship that goes on across the global south and other parts of the world. And that's incredibly important. I think personally, the conversation around the culture story for me that's being teared down is the sense of individualism. All my relationships are what benefits me, transactional, knowledge, reputation, lifeability. And yet Christ has shown me, demonstrated through his own relationships, the story of Ruth and Naomi, how he ministered. He crossed so many boundaries, faith boundaries, cultural boundaries, not theological ones, to engage those who weren't like him in order to bring them into the kingdom and do life alongside them. So I think my personal friendships is something that I'm working on, whereby I want them to expand. I want them to look different from me, have different story experience from me, have different political persuasions from me, because they definitely make me a more whole human being and a more robust Christian in that as well.
Yeah, I love that. I think that holding of relationship piece is the root of a lot of the joy in this conversation, but also the root of a lot of the fear and the uncertainty. That actually, for a lot of us, the desire to honor the person in front of them actually can be quite paralyzing, because you don't want to get it wrong. You don't want to put your foot in it. You don't want to misspeak. Gosh, and then invariably, at least in me, where my mouth is sometimes quicker than my brain, that'll come as a shock to both of you, but it has been known. It's just how absolutely appallingly you suddenly realize that you've verbalized something that you had never any intention of putting out into the actual domain. It's not even that you thought it just and that's catastrophic. But it'll just be therapy session. But I think that fear around misspeaking that I hinted at earlier and getting it wrong is counterminded by, as you were suggesting, friendship and the importance of relationship in navigating these things. That actually you can misspeak when somebody knows you and is gracious towards you and just rolls their eyes and goes, "Oh my goodness, Joe, what were you thinking?" And that's gorgeous. And I need that and I rely on that. And so often my assumption is that I need to sometimes put my fear to one side and risk saying something stupid or misunderstanding or because for the sake of relationship, I'm going to put myself out there and ask the question and go, am I supposed to say this? Or what does that, is this a loaded term? I don't understand. Help me navigate this. Friendship allows me to do that. But I'm also aware, I saw a number of commentators after George Floyd push back on I'm not your teacher. It's exhausting to constantly have to speak up, to share, to explain, to give the background. Please stop using me as your personal encyclopedia of all things cultural understanding. It's too much for me to bear. And I think I and a number of other people heard that as well and went, oh, I don't want to exhaust you. I don't want to overwhelm you. I want to honor you. How do I do that? And so silence is increasingly becoming the preferred response and is probably the most dangerous, because it's silence that stills the relationship, stifles the healing, withdraws the opportunity for lament, and ultimately means that there can be no reconciliation. So I find the relationship navigation really interesting / challenging.
Well, so Imran, continue into the kind of God story aspect of this. We've been highlighting it. Spoiler alert, if Joe doesn't say hospitality at the end and getting around the table to have these conversations, I'll be shocked, because so much of it is navigated in relationships where over time you build so you can have those conversations on all sides and learn what's going on. I think for me, the larger story of the Bible has always been to be a light to the nations. The trajectory is towards Revelation, where every nation, tribe and tongue will be coming together. As you were reminding us, Alicia, we're part of this global, much bigger picture. And I guess within my own context, we were a sending nation back in the day. Often the Celtic nations and the UK as a whole was, and there are all sorts of questions around parts of that. And I think that's part of the reframe. We do see ourselves as part of something larger in my own context, but it has historically been, we were these wonderful people helping to carry a light to the nations. And now it's like, actually, there's so many missionaries coming the other way, and we're learning from the larger part of the church around the world. Slowly learning, I would say, but that is absolutely the direction of travel of the text always. Israel gets critiqued most often for not being a light to those around them. It's protective, as the church has so often been, but it's not missional, it's not reaching out, and it's not inviting others into the conversation. So I love the direction of travel, and what you were pushing is that we're part of something much bigger, and remembering that. Other God story moments for you both to want to point to before we move on to presence?
Yeah, I would say the one is one of the names of God, Jehovah and Kadesh, which means the Lord sanctifies. It's from Leviticus 20, verse 8. And if you think about it, even in that story, They've come out of Exodus. They're en route to the promised land, and God gives them this command to be holy, to be set apart, to keep his statutes. Don't take the practices, the ideologies, the cultural stories from Egypt into the promised land, but be consecrated, deconstruct healthily, be sanctified, be holy, be set apart. And I think for me, that's also a challenge. For me, I've mentioned about my relationships. What blockages, what prejudice, what unconscious biases that are actually conscious, but I use that language because I just don't want to name it for what it is, which is prejudice, do I have to certain people? Someone challenged me in a conversation at a conference that, cultural assimilation is not a prerequisite to salvation. Basically, because someone comes from a different part of the world, don't expect them to be Western in order for you to engage with them in prayer or theological conversation or friendship, for goodness sake. That's not a prerequisite. And so the Lord sanctified me. He's wanting to kind of bring out all that is impure so that I can have fellowship with brothers and sisters that look and don't speak, but have the same God at heart, so that we can do mission together.
Right presence, we are looking, does my ethnicity matter? And we wrote in the book about child Q. We actually wrote about it under significance, and there's an argument again as to why it could be in separate sections. That's just for the experts who'd actually read the book. I just want to keep you up to speed there. But and child Q is this case back in 2022. Joe?
I think I wondered whether or not child Q would be our George Floyd moment, that it would be the moment where the UK woke up a little bit and realised just how hideously racist our country can be, and we don't just have to put it over from the America and go, look how bad they are over there. So child Q was, I believe, a 15-year-old girl who was in a school in Greater London and under suspicion of, I think, carrying cannabis. She was strip searched by police officers without a responsible adult with her to advocate for her. She was on her period at the time, so her body was violated quite graphically, and police didn't follow protocol. And it just, as a woman, you hear that story. I would imagine, Alicia, as a Black woman, there's layers on this. There's class, there's generation, there's the female, every layer of body is embodied in this story. And the weight of it is really horrible. And again, when the court case came out and we were able to hear a little bit about what had happened to her, out of the woodwork came so many other stories. And I think that was the other thing that was so shocking in this moment, is that we couldn't deny that this was not it. This isn't a one-off. She wasn't an outlier. This had become standard practice, even though it was against the protocols of the Met Police. And that was the shocking thing, that her body and her significance in that moment did not matter. And that was on every level not okay, and yet had been normalized through practice.
Absolutely. I mean, when the story broke, anger was the initial emotion that came to the fore, in just complete disbelief. I think in everything that you shared, speaking with friends, I honestly said this would not have happened to a white girl of 15 years old. There is no way that whatever the protocol, whatever the assumption of cannabis smoking, would an adult, Met Police, or a school, an institution, allow a girl who is a minor to be strip searched by an adult? I mean, safeguarding, do you see, we go back to that conversation, do you see her as a child? And the conversation clearly is no. And power took over at that moment of point, and a felt of justification that this is what we do. And particularly the police and the Black community, it's not easy, that sense of seeing one another and there being trust is a huge issue in that. So yeah, it definitely did come to the fore. The conversation of colorism also came predominantly back into conversation. But, I said it in my question about if this is the person light skin, fair skin, white, would this have happened? And I don't believe that it would have done. And I don't know how many cases there have been, but it is common practice amongst the Black community that Met Police are strip searching children. And that's who she was. And we need to call it for what it is.
Yeah, so it made me go and look up some of the stats. So half of, there was a kind of review commissioned off the back of that. Half of all of these searches took place without an appropriate adult. 38% were carried out on Black children. 95% were carried out on boys. Half led to no further action. I mean, again, a sign of like how kind of inadequate it seems to be as a measure. And again, lots of safeguarding concerns were raised. And it did seem like there were multiple layers. This would not have happened to somebody almost certainly if they were white. In terms of the male-female, there's almost certainly a kind of class depending on the type of school and the environment, and then where the adults would have engaged differently in that conversation. And I sat down with my daughter and said to her at the time, here's the things that nobody does without you saying, I want my parent, and I am ringing my parent, and I'm doing it now. Now, there's a power dynamic. It's one of the things we want to, because you have the ability to instill that in a child to some degree, and then you have the ability, do you think your child will have the wherewithal to have that conversation and have essentially the power in the moment to do that, even as a teenager? And all of those dynamics are in play. Even as I'm saying what I said to her, I realize she has a different level of power. The school that she's in, it's highly unlikely to happen. She has relationships with teachers that are going to do, everything's different on so many levels. And so I think it was a story that brought together so many parts of the lens for us. It was one why we wanted to kind of focus on that. And I think the other aspect, just to maybe change gears around, one of the things we talk about in presence is the postmodern storylines engagement here. And one of the things it did was push back modernism. So generally, postmodernism comes in for some critique from us at times. But one of the things it heavily does is push back that kind of scientific understanding, a lot of which talked about race as a scientific concept. And there was a real pushback on that. We've seen a lot more various critical theories, if you like, coming into place, rejecting the old power play, the kind of scientific hierarchy. And the reality was that often said Western and white were better. That was a hierarchy that was established on physicality. That was rejected, and that was arguably based on science, and then was replaced by new theories. And while there's been a lot of critique about that, we need to, I think, engage in that story and say, actually, that was a really positive pushback piece around how we do that.
I think it's really important to recognize actually some of the moral journey that we've been on as a society, and that recognition that so much of these things have been based on the assumption of the privileged, that they can disregard the humanity of others because they don't operate in the same power and in the same place. So a minor, a person of color who is a minor, a person of color who is a minor who is a girl, a person of color who is a minor who is a girl who has no adult to advocate for her. So the layers, we haven't mentioned the word, but I think this is probably the moment it comes in, of intersectionality, the point where all of these pieces come together in one human body, in one experience to bear all of that prejudice and discrimination. That is a person's experience, but that is a community's responsibility. And I think for me, that's the purpose of the redemption of the postmodern deconstruction, is to reconstruct what do we as a community want to do in this moment. Because postmodernism is always about tearing everything down. It's all about pulling down the oppression, pulling down the power structures, pulling down the idols, taking everything down so that nothing can oppress me in this moment. But actually, as a community, we have to rebuild. And the invitation of Jesus is to rebuild in his name and in the identity that we find in him. And so I suppose for me, in all of these questions, whether it's the experience of Child Q or whatever it was that we resonate in those stories, in her story and in the stories of others, is what are we going to do to rebuild? Where does the new humanity and the first fruits of that come from? Because it's all very well to tear down the sinfulness of the structures around us, but actually we need to rebuild it in Jesus's name.
Yes, and we've said before, I think the risk of intersectionality is that then it replaces it with a different power play of the most intersectional goes to the top of the tree. Now, I get that it's more complicated on both sides than that, but that's the risk that we're just saying, let's be alert to. there has been a big move around how we understand Jesus and the portrayal of him, the kind of white Jesus portrayal. It's a guy, Warner Salmon, has the most used image of Jesus. It's a very particular image used by both the Catholic and Protestant Church. From a marketing point of view, he was a marketeer. He was genius because he got over 1 billion uses by almost the church globally. But there has been, I think, a recognition of some of that. I really enjoy Kenneth Bailey's work, Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, trying to help us understand so many of the stories in context of like what was Jesus playing on when he said those stories. Like we so miss it because we're coming with a very particular lens. Well, in my context, that would mean you're like, no, you're not seeing him and the stories that he's telling in that context. So as we think presence, Alicia, I'll give the last word for you as we think from the God story perspective on that.
Definitely. Western lens on biblical scriptures. Sometimes we dilute, we think, we assume we have a better way of engaging and pictorially communicating messages, but actually encouraged to read scripture alongside Iranian people, around people from the Middle East, people from the continent of Africa, and how they capture things in a way that I just gloss over. So one of the big God stories is that the Lord is my shepherd from Psalm 23, Jehovah Ra, that, I shall not want. It's a picture of a shepherd that protects. It's a picture of David recognizing that he needs the Lord to fulfill every desire, every need. And then we see in Jesus, in John 10, he described himself as ultimately the good shepherd. And this relationship that the sheep hear his voice, they know his voice, they will not be led astray by the evil one. And it's just this incredible picture that the God of the universe, the divine, not only has authority over all creation, but he wants to know us personally. He wants relationship with us. He wants to know intimacy. His presence has come in human form, embodied, and that we can have a direct relationship with him moving forward. So it's just an incredible picture and kind of imagery of how does a shepherd protect the sheep. Is the same way the Lord wants to protect us, to know his provision, his source of comfort, his sense of blocking out all that is evil and providing safe and green pastures for us to flourish in. But it's also, coming back to Joe's point about rebuilding, how did Jesus model power? He laid down his life for the sheep. And so anyone in any form of leadership, whether you're a parent to a child, whether you're a teacher over a classroom, whether you're a pastor over a church, that shepherd imagery should be something that you model, that power isn't something you grab, that you lord over, that you ignore protocol, but that you're tender to those who are in your care, that you're an intercessor, you're a protector. And so that's something of the new humanity that we could see ushered into communities, to church life, to politics, dare I say it, of a leadership that isn't power grabbing, but is humble, that is meek, and that cares for other people.
Wonderful. And thank you for that. That's so helpful. And I need to move us on to this last part, our participation, because it's going to pull on that power thread you were talking about. Now, this is where we look at purpose and freedom and power. Why is participation so fraught around this topic and in this moment? Decolonizing the curriculum, the removal of statues, reparations, health inequalities, and institutional kind of racism in the NHS. There's a number of things we've mentioned there. Alicia, I know one of those I think you're most passionate about. Like, where are we seeing this kind of fraught participation, or what do you want to say on this as we land in?
Let's start with the small issue of migration. The conversation around migration is so toxic around the world. I was on a trip in Japan. They're having the same conversations around migration. They want to own and maintain their ethnic heritage. They don't want it to be Western. They don't want it to be colonized in any way, shape, or form. And Japanese is both its language, its kind of pseudo Shinto and Buddhism culture that informs everything. Migration is so complex, and yet the Christian story is one of migration. I, praise God, am a follower of Jesus because the faith had crossed many boundaries, ethnic boundaries, physical boundaries, generational boundaries. People have moved east to west, north to south, all of it, they've moved. And yet the challenge that we find ourselves in is the conversation around persecution, and particularly those that are coming to the UK who are trying to seek refuge and asylum. There's this internal conversation within the church of hospitality is not the answer. It's not the solution. We need to be both wise in who comes into our country. We need to have higher borders, stronger borders, all these sorts of things. And I know Being Human explored this conversation. And yet the reality is that people are fleeing in search of refuge. And biblically, there is a mandate of hospitality that somewhat goes above the law of the land. I'll caveat that. But our hearts shouldn't be guarded. Our hearts shouldn't be resistant. Yes, there's wisdom and there's discernment. And I take this encouragement from a pastor in Beirut, Lebanon, Dr. Hikmat Kashu, who is leading a church in the middle of warfare where people are coming from Syria, Iraq. 70% of his congregation are refugees. He has 3 campuses, so many people he's serving the needs on. And he is adamant that hospitality is the key to stewarding and in showing people who Jesus is. Now, if he can say that in Lebanon, that has far worse of a reality of war, famine, crisis, political instability, that's something that I should pay attention to here in the UK. He's saying hospitality does something more supernatural for cultures for where hospitality is more earned rather than it's freely given. That you would sit at tables, not you necessarily being the host. His challenge was to the Westerners, why don't you be hosted? Reverse the power dynamic, step into their world, listen, eat their food, hear their stories. And so I do think there's a level of participation around migration for which the church needs to really grapple with and moving forward.
I'm so happy somebody else is on the hospitality bandwagon and basically just proves that I'm right in saying that hospitality is the solution to almost everything.
No, it proves you read your Bible, Joe. That's what it proves.
I'm right in my righteousness. Excellent. I think what Alicia's done beautifully is tie the storylines that we're seeing in participation into our practices, because you can't participate unless you practice. So I find the participation piece, and I think we've hinted at this throughout, because it talks about the power dynamics, who has the power, what power is in play, and what are you doing with the power that you have. I think that's a massive question, and we see that in all of the examples that Peter just listed. But I think for me, therefore, some of the recognition that we do, each of us have some degree of power, whether or not we are empowered or whether or not we feel like our power is diminished, we do still have some degree of power in this world. And therefore, how we respond to the world that we inhabit there is still a personal responsibility. I'm hugely affected by what a friend of ours, Gemma Bishaw, says around the starting point in so many of these conversations, and so much of the activism is around gratitude. And he has a really helpful definition of what gratitude is. It's not just simply about being thankful. It is about acknowledging the goodness in any and all circumstances. Where is the blessing? Where is the grace? What is good in this moment? And actually, that can be deeply, deeply challenging. But it also recognizes that in all circumstances, God is good. But he also sits with us in the dust, in the lament, in the anger, and in the grief. And so for me, there is a challenge around where is our gratitude in this space? And how does a sense of gratitude and seeking out God's goodness orientate us to also seeking his justice and his peace? And how do those two things sit together in the fact that God's character is good, merciful, and just? And I find that a really helpful challenge.
I'll say study, partly because while I love hospitality, there are some limits into how many people you can be hospitable with in Northern Ireland across cultures. That's just the geography limit. So I do love that, and I get to go to London and other places a lot, and I do get that. But I have really enjoyed reading people like Esau Macaulay, reading While Black, Vinras Ramachanda, Willie Jennings. I mean, there's a range of people. I've got a book here, Reparations, with Duke Kwan and Greg Thompson. And again, it's about a call to repentance and repair. There's some really interesting, I think thoughtful writers. I think it's really good to read things we disagree with, to really try and stretch our imagination and understand the global church here and some of the stuff that's going on both in the UK and the US and some of the difference in those things. So anyway, study from me. But Alicia, last word on practices to you.
Well, continuing on the study theme, I forgot to reference his book. So it's Jesus in Turbulent Times, Discipleship Making in the Arab World. Recommend it highly. So yes, definitely study hospitality. For those that are like Peter that are dismissing it, honestly, relationship is key, and particularly where there's relationship deprivation in the UK amongst all different demographics. I think we don't practice hospitality well. We invite those that are like us, that look like us, that are from our friendship groups. Hospitality, biblically practiced, is crossing thresholds with those that we know the least, but we're inviting them or being invited to their table in order to share Jesus. So don't dismiss hospitality. Another one for which I think is really important is intercession, and not just praying privately in your room, but you becoming an answer to the prayer that you prayed. And that combines both study, it combines hospitality, and it's you stepping out and engaging in the world in practical ways. I'm an activist at heart, but I know that I need to be a prayer warrior first. And so a lot of my activism is informed by what the Lord shows me through scriptures and through praying with others that can be an answer to prayer, to moving things forward, where difference is celebrated and the church models that Revelation 21 picture.
Wonderful. Thank you. In case anybody is confused, I am a fan of hospitality. I'm recognizing the limitations of where I live. More EA members have been to my house, I'm going to argue, than anybody else in the organisation, despite the place where I live.
As the UK director, I think that's important. So yeah,
absolutely. I love it too. They've been invited. So here, we love hospitality. Listen, so helpful on the practices. Let me just say again, we have done our best to be really open and honest in the conversation. That meant you've got some raw commentary from us. No doubt somebody will be wondering why we've said that, or maybe a little perplexed. Give us a little bit of grace as we've tried to do this as honestly as we could. And we hope it's been really helpful. It is our passion to serve the church. This comes to you from Being Human, a project of the Evangelical Alliance. We love the whole church here in the UK and globally. We're part of a larger movement, and we are doing our best to wrestle with the big issues and put ethnicity right at the core of the Being Human lens. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you again soon. Be blessed.